I love the topic of reinvention. Now, we reinvent our lives a number of times through our lifespan, but I think the most exciting time for reinvention is at midlife and beyond. So there are two different types of reinvention. Typically, the first type is the intentional reinvention. And that's when we choose to change some aspects of our life. It could be changing our jobs, changing where we live, changing our relationship in some way. And that's something that we do intentionally. The second type of reinvention is what I call circumstantial reinvention. And this is when, through no choice of our own, our life circumstances change and we are forced to reinvent ourselves. And this one can feel really, really challenging purely because it was not our choice. So let's look at first circumstantial reinvention. And this could be the loss of a job or career. In my case, I closed my business in 2015. So that was a huge reinvention. Wasn't my choice, but it certainly was the best outcome for me. And I usually find too with reinvention is we can resist it quite a lot when it's not our choice, but it can end up having the best outcome for us or taking us down a journey or a path that we hadn't even thought about before. So another way of circumstantial reinvention, another example of circumstantial reinvention is a relationship breakdown or a divorce. Again, there's another really, really hard one. So quite often we may not be ready for this change and we can just wake up one day and our partner tells us that they're no longer in love with us, they've been seeing someone else, they've fallen in love with someone else, or they just don't want to be with us anymore. So these sort of reinventions, when we're forced into these situations, can be very, very painful. Another hard circumstantial reinvention is around health. So we may get into an accident, we may have serious illness or some form of disability. So my brother-in-law, who I adore, absolutely love him to death, recently had a stroke. And now he has mobility issues and his whole life has changed and he's had to reinvent his life, what his life will look like for the next decade or so. Another example of circumstantial reinvention as well is the financial hardship. So we might lose our job and therefore go into a financial circumstance that we hadn't planned for, that suddenly we can no longer afford to keep our homes and we have to sell our homes and maybe move suburbs or even move states. So all of this can be really, really challenging. Another example of circumstantial reinvention is that we all went through was like where the COVID-19. Who would have thought of a global pandemic? Well, one that forced all of us to pivot. For the first time, we heard the words pivot, pivot, pivot. How are we going to pivot? What are we going to do next? How are we going to make the adjustments? So those sort of circumstantial reinvention that happens to us without our choice can be very, very painful. But they force us to adapt and adjust, and most of us do. And we see with the example of the pandemic where despite how difficult that was and it was on a global scale, that we all adjusted. So that reinvention. So for me, in terms of work, I reinvented myself from a face-to-face counselor and therapist to an online. And a lot of the modalities that I thought I could not do online suddenly worked. So I love reinvention because it really does force us to challenge ourselves and grow out of our comfort zone and see ourselves or circumstances beyond what we thought was possible. So some of what I wanted to talk about was my personal experience of reinvention is quite recently. Most of it is that I cut my hair. I went from having silver braids, which I was very invested in that look because I love the idea of silver sirens having silver hair. And I didn't have silver hair, I didn't have grey hair, and I wanted it so badly. So I would always wear silver braids. And when I turned 60, I wanted to change the way that I looked. I wanted to reinvent my look. I wanted to reinvent myself. And a really obvious way to do that was to do something as drastic as cut my braids off and then cut off my own natural hair to take it right down. And I love it because what it felt to me was I felt like I was hiding underneath the hair. And cutting the hair and allowing you to see all of me, for me, it felt like a coming out of hiding. And it was reinventing and bringing forth this bold new 60-year-old. And that's how it feels. I feel like my 60 is about being bold. And that reinvention is, what would a bold woman in her 60s do? And she would do what she wants to do. And part of that was take her hair off and allow yourself to be visible. So, just exploring your own reinvention journey and experience. What has that been like for you? And did you have circumstantial reinvention? Were you forced to reinvent, or was it intentional? So some of ours are circumstantial, like me losing my business, closing down my business. That was not my choice. That was painful. And to something like this, transforming my physical look, reinventing my look, which was a choice, which was joyful. Scary too, but joyful. See you soon.